The day Jung first saw the connection, he must have felt that peculiar vertigo reserved for those who discover hidden patterns in seemingly separate worlds. There in his study, surrounded by medieval alchemical texts with their strange imagery and a cryptic language, the psychiatrist recognized Christ's face, staring back at him from the Philosopher's Stone. Not metaphorically, not analogically, but psychologically identical. In Psychology and Alchemy, Jung writes, "We can accuse Christianity of arrested development if we are determined to excuse our own shortcomings, but I do not wish to make the mistake of blaming religion for something that is due mainly to human incompetence." This statement reveals Jung's characteristic blend of clinical precision and profound respect for religious experience. He sees beyond superficial criticisms to the deeper psychological patterns at work. The connection Jung uncovered between Christ and the Lapis Philosophorum reveals something extraordinary about Western consciousness itself, how it expresses the same fundamental psychological process through seemingly opposite symbolic languages. The Christian drama of salvation through divine grace and the alchemical quest for transformation through human effort turn out to be twin manifestations of the psyche's journey toward wholeness. Jung watched as historians dismissed alchemy as primitive proto-chemistry, while theologians guarded Christ's uniqueness against any comparisons to pagan symbols. Yet neither group recognized what Jung saw clearly, that there is a pattern of psychological development that manifests consistently across cultures and epochs beyond context and doctrine. When Jung writes that Christian education has done all that is humanly possible, but it has not been enough, he acknowledges that something is missing in Western spiritual development, something the alchemists were unconsciously attempting to recover through their secretive operations. While Christianity externalized the divine drama, alchemy re-interiorized it, recognizing transformation as an internal process requiring active engagement with both spirit and matter, as both are parts of existence. I am Irrevelato. I reveal the hidden connections and the secrets you deserve to know. The lives and stories of luminaries and oftentimes gods. In this video essay, we'll explore this remarkable connection through Jung's penetrating analysis. We'll witness how medieval alchemists themselves recognized Christ in their stone, how they understood their chemical processes as parallel to Christian mysteries, and how their work compensated psychologically for what conventional Christianity had left incomplete. As you know, I prefer to philosophize with a hammer like Nietzsche. The path will take us through the twilight realm where religion, psychology, spirit, matter, conscious ideals and unconscious shadows converge in an unexpected harmony. We'll discover how Jung excavated these forgotten connections to reveal a path towards psychological wholeness that remains vital for modern consciousness. Before we begin this journey, I want to thank you for being here. Your engagement, whether through likes, shares, or simply watching these videos through to completion, helps ensure this type of in-depth video essays, as bad as they are, reaches others who seek deeper understanding, who love wisdom, who would sacrifice themselves for truth and freedom, who bears the price of Lucifer and Prometheus, if that's what we need to move forward and realize that we are descendants of Plato, Socrates, Pythagoras, Thales, Nietzsche, Jung, Da Vinci, Tesla, Newton, Spinoza, Kierkegaard, and even deities or other alien form of life either way. There's a reason why you are here. See it, seize it, conquer it, master it. The only one who can lead your destiny is you. It always was. It always will be. You'll find additional resources and ways to support this work in the description below. Now let's reveal Jung's discovery of how Christ and the Philosopher's Stone became parallel expressions of the Western psyche's deepest transformative patterns. Throughout alchemical literature, Jung reveals explicit parallels between Christ and the Philosopher's Stone. Both religious and alchemical symbols are underlined by a consistent psychological pattern. The oldest text Jung identifies making this connection is Raymond Lully's Codicillus from the 14th century. And as Jesus Christ of the House of David took on human nature for the deliverance and redemption of mankind, who were in the bonds of sin on account of Adam's disobedience. So likewise in our art, that which has been wrongfully defiled by one thing is absolved by its opposite, cleansed and delivered from that stain. Just a few decades later, Petrus Bonus writes in Pretiosa Margarita Novella, 1330 to 1339. The old philosophers discerned the last judgment in this art, namely in the germination and birth of the stone, for in it the soul to be beatified unites with its original body to eternal glory. So also the ancients knew that a virgin must conceive and bring forth, for in their art the stone begets, conceives, and brings itself forth. The parallel becomes increasingly explicit through the centuries. By 1619, the anonymous author of Wasserstein der Weisen dedicates nearly 50 pages to demonstrating how the rejected cornerstone, lapis angularis equals Christ, accords, and is in exceeding subtle and artful agreement with the terrestrial and corporeal philosophical stone, showing how that the terrestrial philosophical stone is a veritable harmonia, contrafactur, and prototype of the true spiritual and heavenly stone, Jesus Christ. What's particularly noteworthy about these parallels is that they come from practicing Christians, not heretics or pagans trying to undermine Christianity. They were believers who felt the spiritual connection between their religious faith and their alchemical work. As Jung observes, the author of this sentence must have been undergoing the experience of the nigredo, the first stage of the work, which was felt as melancholia in alchemy and corresponds to the encounter with the shadow in psychology. The visual evidence reinforces these textual connections. Alchemical manuscripts depict the lapis crowned like a king, crucified like Christ, rising from the tomb like the resurrected Savior. The stone undergoes death, burial, and resurrection. It mediates between worlds, transforms the base into the precious, and reconciles opposites, just as Christ mediates between humanity and God. Ripley captures this symbolic parallelism vividly. Christ said, "I, if I be lifted up, will draw all men unto me." From that time forward, when both parts, having been crucified and exanimated, are betrothed to one another, man and wife shall be buried together, and afterward quickened again by the Spirit of life. The Tractatus Aureus describes the stone's process in language eerily reminiscent of Easter. But when we marry the crowned king with the red daughter, she will conceive a son in the gentle fire, and shall nourish him through our fire. Our dead son shall live. The king shall come forth from the fire and rejoice in the marriage. The hidden things shall be disclosed, and the virgin's milk be whitened. The son is become a warrior fire and surpasses the tincture, for he himself is the treasure, and himself is attired in the philosophic matter. Even the stone's attributes mirror Christ's. Jung notes how alchemists describe the lapis as health and long life in felicity, on account of which our stone is chiefly to be sought, a direct parallel to Christ as source of eternal life. Heinrich Kuhnrath called Mercurius virginal, because he has never increased any kind of metallic body in the bowels of the earth, a clear parallel to the Virgin Mary. But Jung's insight goes deeper than merely cataloguing these parallels. He recognizes they reveal something fundamental about human psychology, how the same archetypal patterns manifest through different symbols and contexts. The Christ story and the alchemical opus express the same psychic process, the journey toward wholeness, integration, and self-realization through distinct symbolic systems. Jung writes, "The Lapis-Christ Parallel establishes an analogy between the transforming substance and Christ. In the Middle Ages, doubtless under the influence of the doctrine of transubstantiation, though in earlier times, the Gnostic tradition of older pagan ideas was the dominant factor. Mercurius is likened to the serpent hung on the cross, John 3:14, to mention only one of the numerous parallels. This observation exemplifies how symbolic thinking is not restricted by any historical imperatives. It always finds new expressions while maintaining psychological continuity. The same transformative process that Gnostics expressed through their complex mythologies reappeared in Christianity through Christ symbolism and in alchemy through the philosopher's stone. Both Christ and the lapis undergo a threefold transformation that reveals their psychological significance. In Christianity, this appears as Christ's passion, death, and resurrection. In alchemy, it manifests as the nigredo, blackening, albedo, whitening, and rubedo, reddening, the three main stages of the great work. The parallels are striking. Christ's suffering corresponds to the nigredo, the stage of decomposition, putrefaction, and dissolution, where the prima materia breaks down into its constituent elements. This is psychologically equivalent to confronting the shadow, experiencing the dissolution of the ego, and facing the darkness within. Christ's death parallels the albedo, the whitening phase where purification occurs. Psychologically, this represents the emergence of insight after confronting the shadow, the birth of new consciousness after the death of old identity. Christ's resurrection corresponds to the rubedo, the reddening phase where the philosopher's stone achieves its transformative power. Psychologically, this represents the integration of opposites, the reconciliation of conscious and unconscious elements, the achievement of psychological wholeness. Or as Jung writes, the rubedo then follows directly from the albedo as the result of raising the heat of the fire to its highest intensity. The red and the white axe, king and queen, who may also celebrate their chemical wedding at this stage. Jung also notes how Heinrich Kunrath described this process. Through circumrotation, or a circular philosophical revolving of the quaternarius, it is brought back to the highest and purest simplicity of the plusquamperfect Catholic monad. Out of the gross and impure one there cometh an exceeding pure and subtile one. This circular process mirrors the Christian narrative of incarnation, crucifixion and resurrection, the divine descending into matter, suffering within it, and transforming it from within. Both patterns express the same psychological reality, the transformation of consciousness through stages of dissolution and reintegration. Jung observes how Eastern and Western approaches to transformation differ fundamentally. Western man is held in thrall by the 10,000 things. He sees only particulars. He is ego-bound and thing-bound, and unaware of the deep root of all being. Eastern man, on the other hand, experiences the world of particulars, and even his own ego, like a dream. He is rooted essentially in the ground, which attracts him so powerfully that his relations with the world are relativized to a degree that is often incomprehensible to us. This difference manifests in how Christianity and alchemy approach transformation. Christianity emphasizes external worship of Christ as divine savior, while alchemy focuses on internal transformation through active engagement with material processes. Jung writes, the Western attitude, with its emphasis on the object, tends to fix the ideal, Christ, in its outward aspect, and thus to rob it of its mysterious relation to the inner man. This externalization creates a psychological void. If the supreme value, Christ, and the supreme negation, sin, are outside, then the soul is void. Its highest and lowest are missing. Alchemy compensates for this externalization by re-interiorizing the transformative process. The alchemist doesn't merely worship the stone as an external object, but actively participates in its creation through laboratory operations that symbolically parallel inner psychological development. The alchemist ultimately does the work of Christ and becomes like Christ even when that is not his intention. This compensation reveals the complementary nature of Christianity and alchemy, how they approach the same psychological reality from opposite directions. Christianity descends from spirit to matter through divine incarnation. Alchemy ascends from matter to spirit through human transformation of physical substances. Their opposition reflects the divided nature of Western consciousness, split between spiritual aspiration and material existence, between worship of transcendent divinity and engagement with immanent reality, between passive reception of grace and active participation in transformation. The principle of polarity is always present and in motion. Jung identifies a crucial psychological difference between Christ and the alchemical self that reveals the divided nature of Western consciousness. The self is a union of opposites par excellence, and this is where it differs essentially from the Christ symbol. The androgyny of Christ is the utmost concession the Church has made to the problem of opposites. Christianity presents Christ as pure goodness, with evil externalized as Satan. This creates a fundamental split in Western psychology. Consciousness identifies with light and goodness. Shadow elements are projected outward as evil and darkness. Jung observes, the opposition between light and good on the one hand, and darkness and evil on the other, is left in a state of open conflict, since Christ simply represents good, and his counterpart, the devil, evil. This opposition is the real-world problem, which at present is still unsolved. This unresolved tension shapes Western consciousness profoundly. We inherit a psychological template that splits light from shadow rather than integrating them. We identify with our conscious ideals while projecting our disowned shadows onto others. We seek moral perfection rather than psychological wholeness. The alchemical self offers a different approach to this problem. It contains all opposites in paradoxical unity. It doesn't split good from evil, but transforms one into the other through conscious integration. Jung writes, the self, however, is absolutely paradoxical in that it represents in every respect thesis and antithesis, and at the same time synthesis. The alchemical Mercurius exemplifies this paradoxical nature. Jung describes it as the dragon that devours, fertilizes, begets, slays, and brings itself to life again. Being hermaphroditic, it is compounded of opposites and is at the same time their uniting symbol, at once deadly poison, basilisk, scorpion, panacea, and savior. This integration of opposites is not heretical, it's not rebellion, it's not corruption. It's a psychological compensation that is necessary for gnosis. Where Christianity split light from shadow, alchemy sought their reconciliation. Where Christianity externalized evil as Satan, alchemy recognized the shadow as bubbling transformative potentiality. Jung states with characteristic directness, in the self good and evil are indeed closer than identical twins. The true self isn't purely good, it's complete. It doesn't reject darkness but transforms it through conscious integration. Thus, Jung emphasizes that genuine transformation requires confronting the tension of opposites within ourselves. Without the experience of the opposites, there is no experience of wholeness and hence no inner approach to the sacred figures. But the confrontation creates genuine suffering, a psychological crucifixion paralleling Christ's physical one. Jung writes, the reality of evil and its incompatibility with good cleave the opposites asunder and lead inexorably to the crucifixion and suspension of everything that lives. Yet this suffering becomes transformative when understood as necessary for psychological growth. We all have to be crucified with Christ, which means being suspended in a moral suffering equivalent to veritable crucifixion. As already stated, alchemists express this psychological truth in the nigredo, the blackening phase where the prima materia decomposes before transformation begins, which parallels Christ's death and burial, the necessary dissolution of old identity before resurrection occurs. Jung acknowledges this integration isn't easy. In practice, this is only possible up to a point, and apart from that is so unbearable and inimical to life that the ordinary human being can afford to get into such a state only occasionally, in fact as seldom as possible. For how could he remain ordinary in face of such suffering? This recognition leads to what Jung calls a probabilistic attitude toward evil, an acceptance that perfect integration remains beyond ordinary human capacity, and that we must find practical ways to live with our inner divisions without either denying them or being destroyed by them. The shadow, those aspects of ourselves we disown and project onto others, is very important in this process. He writes, the encounter with the dark half of the personality, or shadow, comes about of its own accord in any moderately thorough treatment. This problem is as important as that of sin in the Church. Confronting the shadow creates real psychological suffering. It would be more correct to take the open conflict as a symptom of the psychic situation of Western man, and to deplore his inability to assimilate the whole range of the Christian symbol. The encounter with the dark half of the personality, or shadow, comes about of its own accord in any moderately thorough treatment. This problem is as important as that of sin in the Church. The open conflict is unavoidable and painful. I have often been asked, and what do you do about it? Jung's response is characteristically direct. I do nothing. There is nothing I can do except wait with a certain trust in God until, out of a conflict born with patience and fortitude, there emerges the solution destined, although I cannot foresee it, for that particular person. This attitude differs fundamentally from conventional religious approaches that seek to overcome evil rather than integrate it. Jung observes, "Christ espoused the sinner and did not condemn him. The true follower of Christ will do the same, and since one should do unto others as one would do unto oneself, one will also take the part of the sinner who is oneself." This integration doesn't mean accepting evil uncritically. The danger in this point of view is the same as in the Imitation of Christ, but the Pharisee in us will never allow himself to be caught talking to publicans and whores. It means recognizing our own shadow aspects compassionately, rather than projecting them onto others. Jung draws a crucial distinction. As little as we would accuse Christ of fraternizing with evil, so little should we reproach ourselves that to love the sinner who is oneself is to make a pact with the devil. Love makes a man better, hate makes him worse, even when that man is oneself. This approach transforms our relationship to our own darkness. Rather than split ourselves into good and evil aspects, we recognize that integration requires accepting our whole self, including those elements we'd prefer to disown, and transforming them through conscious presence of spirit and action rather than denial or projection. The alchemists approached this integration symbolically through their work with physical substances. Their operations with mercury, sulfur, and salt paralleled psychological processes of dissolving rigid consciousness, encountering opposing elements, and synthesizing them into new forms. Jung writes, "Whereas the Church's great buttress is the imitation of Christ, the alchemist, without realizing it, and certainly without wanting it, easily fell victim, in the loneliness and obscure problems of his work, to the promptings and unconscious assumptions of his own mind, since, unlike the Christians, he had no clear and unmistakable models on which to rely." This lack of fixed models gave alchemy a psychological flexibility that conventional religion often lacked. The alchemist could explore the interplay of opposites, the transformation of seemingly worthless materials into precious substances, the reconciliation of opposing elements, all without the doctrinal constraints that limited Christian approaches. Jung observes, "The central ideas of Christianity are rooted in Gnostic philosophy, which, in accordance with psychological laws, simply had to grow up at a time when the classical religions had become obsolete." Alchemy continued this Gnostic tradition, exploring the same psychological territory through different symbolic means. The key insight lies in how alchemy approached the problem of evil, not as something to be rejected or overcome, but as an essential component of the transformative process itself. The prima materia, the starting point of the great work, was often described as vile, base, worthless, yet it contained the seed of gold. The nigredo, the blackening phase, represented suffering and dissolution, yet it was necessary for subsequent transformation. This alchemical mind declared that genuine transformation requires engaging with our shadow aspects rather than rejecting them, integrating our darkness rather than projecting it, and recognizing that our basest elements contain the potential for our highest development. But most of us are superficial imitators. Jung diagnoses a fundamental psychological distortion in how Christianity has approached the imitation of Christ. The demand made by the Imitatio Christi, that we should follow the ideal and seek to become like it, ought logically to have the result of developing and exalting the inner man. In actual fact, however, the ideal has been turned by superficial and formalistically minded believers into an external object of worship, and it is precisely this veneration for the object that prevents it from reaching down into the depths of the psyche and giving the latter a wholeness in keeping with the ideal. The transformative pattern embodied in Christ becomes externalized. It becomes an object of worship rather than a template for inner development. The psychic energy that should flow inward toward transformation gets redirected outward toward veneration. Jung identifies the cultural origin of this distortion. The Western attitude, with its emphasis on the object, tends to fix the ideal, Christ, in its outward aspect, and thus to rob it of its mysterious relation to the inner man. This contrasts sharply with Eastern approaches. Eastern man, on the other hand, experiences the world of particulars and even his own ego like a dream. He is rooted essentially in the ground, which attracts him so powerfully that his relations with the world are relativized to a degree that is often incomprehensible to us. This externalization creates a profound psychological void. If the supreme value, Christ, and the supreme negation, sin, are outside, then the soul is void, its highest and lowest are missing. The Western psyche becomes emptied of its transformative potential, its highest aspirations and deepest shadows projected onto external figures, rather than integrated within. The contrast with Eastern consciousness reveals Western psychology's peculiar orientation. The Eastern attitude, more particularly the Indian, is the other way about. Everything, highest and lowest, is in the transcendental subject. Accordingly, the significance of the Atman, the self, is heightened beyond all bounds. But with Western man, the value of the self sinks to zero. This zero value of the self creates the spiritual hunger driving Western technological achievement and material conquest. Unable to find value within, Western consciousness seeks it without, in objects, achievements, dominion. The spiritual hunger persists precisely because its cause remains misdiagnosed. Jung also distinguishes between superficial imitation of Christ's external actions and genuine participation in the psychological pattern Christ represents. Christ can indeed be imitated even to the point of stigmatization without the imitator coming anywhere near the ideal or its meaning. For it is not a question of an imitation that leaves a man unchanged and makes him into a mere artifact, but of realizing the ideal on one's own account, Deo concedente, in one's own individual life. True imitation involves internal transformation rather than external conformity. It means following the same psychological pattern of death to the old identity, confrontation with the shadow, and resurrection as a more integrated being. Jung acknowledges the value of even imperfect imitation. We must not forget, however, that even a mistaken imitation may sometimes involve a tremendous moral effort, which has all the merits of a total surrender to some supreme value, even though the real goal may never be reached and the value is represented externally. Yet this external approach remains psychologically limited. It is conceivable that by virtue of this total effort, a man may even catch a fleeting glimpse of his wholeness, accompanied by the feeling of grace that always characterizes this experience. The deeper problem lies in Christianity's misinterpretation of its own scriptures. It is this prejudice, for instance, which impels the Protestant interpreters of the Bible to interpret entos umon, referring to the kingdom of God, as among you, instead of within you. This mistranslation reflects Western characteristic externalization of consciousness, projecting outward what properly belongs within. The kingdom of God becomes an external reality, rather than an inner psychological state, just as Christ becomes an external figure to be worshipped, rather than an internal pattern to be realized. Jung identifies a specific danger in the external approach to Christ's imitation. The mistaken idea of a merely outward imitatio Christi is further exacerbated by a typically European prejudice which distinguishes the Western attitude from the Eastern. This externalization creates a psychological short-circuit where sin and redemption both happen outside the self. If the ideal is wholly outside, then the sins of the individual are also outside, and consequently he is more of a fragment than ever, since superficial misunderstanding conveniently enables him, quite literally, to cast his sins upon Christ, and thus to evade his deepest responsibilities, which is contrary to the spirit of Christianity. The psychological consequence is a divided self that never achieves integration. Such formalism and laxity were not only one of the prime causes of the Reformation, they are also present within the body of Protestantism. Jung isn't criticizing authentic religious experience, but diagnosing how its external orientation prevents genuine psychological transformation. Christian education has done all that is humanly possible, but it has not been enough. Too few people have experienced the divine image as the innermost possession of their own souls. Christ only meets them from without, never from within the soul. That is why dark paganism still reigns there. A paganism which, now in a form so blatant that it can no longer be denied, and now in all too threadbare disguise, is swamping the world of so-called Christian civilization. This pagan undercurrent represents the unconscious compensating for Christianity's one-sided emphasis on goodness, light and spirit. The rejected darkness, materiality and instinctuality don't disappear but go underground, emerging in distorted forms that contradict conscious Christian values. The alchemists intuitively sensed this problem and addressed it symbolically through their work. Rather than externalizing the divine, they sought it within matter itself, including the most despised and rejected substances. Jung writes, "The alchemist was concerned with the problem of how to implant the soul in the body. This approach inverted the conventional Christian emphasis on transcending the body to reach spiritual reality. The alchemists sought to spiritualize matter rather than escape it, to discover the divine fire within the material world rather than seeking it beyond. This inversion appears in how alchemists described their stone. Where Christianity emphasized Christ's perfection, alchemy acknowledged the stone's paradoxical nature, its simultaneous darkness and light, poison and medicine, material and spiritual qualities. Jung notes how the Aurora Consurgens connected Christ with the philosophic man, the microcosm, the one that dieth not, and bringeth alive anything dead. This identification reveals the true meaning of Christ's imitation, not external conformity, but internal transformation through the same pattern of death and rebirth that Christ's life symbolizes. The alchemical perspective offers a psychological corrective to Christianity's external orientation. It suggests that genuine transformation requires engaging with material reality rather than transcending it, integrating darkness rather than rejecting it, and recognizing divinity within the world rather than beyond it. This brings us to the heart of Jung's insight, the fundamental difference in how Christianity and alchemy approach redemption, and what this reveals about Western psychology's divided nature. Jung identifies a profound reversal in how Christianity and alchemy approach redemption. Whereas in Christianity it is man who needs redemption, in alchemy it is God's anima mundi, imprisoned in matter. Christianity positions humanity as fallen and in need of divine intervention from above. Alchemy positions the divine as imprisoned in matter and in need of human liberation from below. Jung elaborates, "For the alchemist, the one primarily in need of redemption is not man, but the deity who is lost and sleeping in matter. Only as a secondary consideration does he hope that some benefit may accrue to himself from the transformed substance as the panacea, the medicina catholica." The unconscious corrects the one-sidedness of conscious religious attitudes. Where Christianity emphasizes divine grace descending from above, alchemy emphasizes human effort ascending from below. Where Christianity focuses on transcendence, alchemy focuses on immanence. Jung writes, "His attention is not directed to his own salvation through God's grace, but to the liberation of God from the darkness of matter. By applying himself to this miraculous work, he benefits from its salutary effect, but only incidentally." Two fundamentally different approaches and relationships to the same goal, transformation. The Christian approaches redemption through surrender to divine grace. The alchemist approaches it through active participation in liberating the divine from matter. Jung distinguishes between opus operatum and opus operantis. The Christian receives the fruits of the Mass for himself personally. The alchemist, on the other hand, receives the fructus arboris immortalis, not merely for himself, but first and foremost for the king or the king's son, for the perfecting of the coveted substance. The alchemical divine is immanent, present even in what conventional religion would consider profane or impure. Jung writes, "The substance that harbors the divine secret is everywhere, including the human body. It can be had for the asking and can be found anywhere, even in the most loathsome filth." The spiritual quest shifts then from transcendence to immanence, from seeking divinity beyond the world to discovering it within. As Jung observes, the source of life is like El-Qidr, a good companion, though it is not without its dangers, as Moses of old found to his cost, according to the Quran. It is the symbol of the life force that eternally renews itself and of the clock that never runs down. The alchemists expressed this immanence through their work with physical substances. They didn't seek the divine beyond matter, but within it, in the transformation of base metals into gold, of the prima materia into the philosopher's stone, of the nigredo's darkness into the rubedo's light. Jung quotes an uncanonical saying of our Lord that captures this perspective: "He who is near unto me is near unto the fire." This connection between divinity and transformative fire appears in Heraclitus's concept of pur ai zoon, ever-living fire, and in the alchemical understanding of their aqua nostra as ignis fire. The source of this fire lies not above but below. The source means not only the flow of life but its warmth, indeed its heat, the secret of passion, whose synonyms are always fiery. The all-dissolving aqua nostra is an essential ingredient in the production of the lapis. But the source is underground, and therefore the way leads underneath. Only down below can we find the fiery source of life. The descent contrasts sharply with Christianity's obsession with ascent, with the rising above material concerns to reach spiritual reality. The alchemical perspective suggests that genuine transformation requires descending into the depths of matter, into the unconscious, into the shadow, into the abyss, into the soil, into the darkness, into the problem that needs to be solved, into the risks you have to take to make your dreams come true. You will never discover your transformative potential if you try to evade responsibility for these circumstances and states. Without conscious intention, the alchemist assumes the role of redeemer, not of humanity, of course, but of the divine fire imprisoned in matter. Jung observes, without knowing it, the alchemist carries the idea of the imitatio a stage further and reaches the conclusion we mentioned earlier, that complete assimilation to the Redeemer would enable him, the assimilated, to continue the work of redemption in the depths of his own psyche. This unconscious assumption leads to a revolutionary conclusion. Had the alchemist succeeded in forming any concrete idea of his unconscious contents, he would have been obliged to recognize that he had taken the place of Christ, or to be more exact, that he, regarded not as ego but as self, had taken over the work of redeeming not man but God. He would then have had to recognize not only himself as the equivalent of Christ, but Christ as a symbol of the self, a turning point in the development of Western consciousness, if you ask me. But this tremendous conclusion failed to dawn on the medieval mind. The alchemists approached this insight unconsciously, but couldn't articulate it explicitly within their cultural framework. Jung writes, "The artifact himself bears no correspondence to Christ. Rather, he sees this correspondence to the Redeemer in his wonderful stone." Yet the psychological reality is that the alchemist, through his work with material substances, was unconsciously participating in the redemptive process in a way that Christianity reserved for Christ alone. This participation appears in how alchemists described their work. They worked through the process to liberate the divine spark from the last places you expected, rather than expect salvation. The blending of individual effort, divine grace, and scientific knowledge is indeed a more integrated approach to transformation than Christianity's emphasis on grace alone. The psychological implications are considerable. Alchemy suggests that genuine transformation requires active engagement, that redemption involves liberating the divine within rather than receiving it from without, and that the sacred process requires human agency as much as divine initiation. Jung recognizes that both Christianity and alchemy express the same fundamental psychological process: the transformation of consciousness through stages of dissolution and reintegration. Their approaches differ not in essence, but in orientation, one descending from above, one ascending from below, one emphasizing divine action, one emphasizing human participation. He writes, "In the end, the study of these parallels leads to the psychological conclusion that we are dealing with the same phenomenon, now expressed in religious terms, now in the language of philosophical alchemy." The complementary nature of these approaches reveals how Western consciousness has struggled to integrate opposing elements of human experience, divine and human, spiritual and material, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow. We continue projecting these polarities outward, rather than reconciling them within. Jung's analysis doesn't diminish religious meaning, but deepens it, revealing the psychological reality behind religious symbolism. Christ functions as a profound symbol of the self, the organizing principle of the total psyche that integrates conscious and unconscious elements in a higher unity. This brings us to Jung's most comprehensive understanding of Christ as a symbol of the self, the archetype of wholeness, the true goal of psychology. Jung makes an extraordinary observation about Christ's psychological greatness. As a matter of fact, we are dealing here with a content that up to the present has only very rarely been attributed to any human personality. The one great exception is Christ. As Weos to Anthropou, the Son of Man, and as Theoios, the Son of God, he embodies the God-man, and as an incarnation of the Logos by pneumatic impregnation, he is an avatar of the divine nous. Jung complementary writes in Ion, "In the empirical self, light and shadow form a paradoxical unity. This totality distinguishes the self from the ego, which represents only the conscious personality. Where the ego identifies with particular qualities and rejects others, the self integrates all elements of the psyche into a dynamic whole." Jung notes, hence in its scientific usage, the term self refers neither to Christ nor to the Buddha, but to the totality of the figures that are its equivalent, and each of these figures is a symbol of the self. Christ thus symbolizes the archetype of the self, the totality of the psyche that includes both conscious and unconscious elements. He symbolizes the integration of divine and human dimensions, the reconciliation of opposites, the achievement of psychological wholeness. Jung observes, we are concerned here with the process of individuation, a process which has constantly been held up to Western man in the dogmatic and religious model of the life of Christ. But this psychological greatness remains obscured. The accent has always fallen on the historicity of the Saviour's life, and because of this its symbolical nature has remained in the dark. This obscuration redirects psychological energy away from inner transformation toward external worship. The pattern for individuation becomes historical narrative rather than psychological template. Jung recognizes Christ as a universal archetype, transcending specific religious traditions. There is thus a pre-Christian as well as a non-Christian Christ, insofar as he is an autonomous psychological fact. The Christ figure represents the human potential for wholeness, integration, and self-realization that exists independently of religious doctrine. Jung identifies numerous parallels between Christ and the self-archetype. Both represent the integration of divine and human dimensions, both undergo transformation through suffering and death, both emerge as mediators between opposing realms. These parallels explain why Christ functions so effectively as a symbol of the self. Jung writes, "The almost limitless range of the self might be deemed a disadvantage as compared with the definiteness of a religious figure, but it is by no means the task of science to pass value judgments." This appears in various symbolic forms. The quaternary structure of Christ's symbolism reveals its connection to psychological wholeness. Jung observes how Christ, enthroned with the four emblems of the evangelists, represents a mandala-like structure that symbolizes psychic totality. It parallels Father Horus with his four sons, or Osiris with the four sons of Horus. These four elements also correspond to the psychological functions Jung identified: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition, whose integration constitutes psychological completeness. This quaternary structure represents psychological wholeness, the integration of the four functions of consciousness. The solar symbolism reinforces this connection. Horus is also the Helios Anatoles, rising sun, and Christ was still worshipped as such by the early Christians. The rising sun represents the emergence of integrated consciousness from the darkness of unconsciousness, a universal symbol of psychological transformation. Yet Jung also identifies a crucial difference between Christ and the self. The self is a union of opposites par excellence, and this is where it differs essentially from the Christ symbol. The androgyny of Christ is the utmost concession the Church has made to the problem of opposites. Christianity presents Christ as pure goodness, with evil externalized as Satan. The self, however, contains both light and shadow in dynamic tension. Jung writes, "The opposition between light and good on the one hand and darkness and evil on the other is left in a state of open conflict, since Christ simply represents good and his counterpart, the devil, evil." This difference reveals why alchemy provided a necessary psychological complement to Christianity. Where Christianity split good and evil into opposing figures, alchemy sought their reconciliation in the paradoxical nature of the lapis, simultaneously poison and medicine, darkness and light, material and spiritual. Jung explains why both Christ and the lapis functioned as projections of the self-archetype. The projection of the Redeemer image, which is the correspondence between Christ and the lapis, is therefore almost a psychological necessity. The self-archetype typically remains unconscious, manifesting through projection onto external figures and symbols. Jung writes, "Once the exploration of the unconscious has led the conscious mind to an experience of the archetype, the individual is confronted with the abysmal contradictions of human nature, and this confrontation in turn leads to the possibility of a direct experience of light and darkness, of Christ and the devil. The confrontation with opposites forms the heart of individuation, the process of psychological integration toward wholeness." Jung observes, "For better or worse, there is only a bare possibility of this, and not a guarantee. For experiences of this kind cannot of necessity be induced by any human means. There are factors to be considered which are not under our control." The arbitrary nature of this process explains why religious symbols affect people differently. Experience of the opposites has nothing whatsoever to do with intellectual insight or with empathy. It is more what we would call fate. Such an experience can convince one person of the truth of Christ, another of the truth of the Buddha, to the exclusion of all other evidence. This doesn't diminish religious meaning but deepens it, revealing how religious symbols connect to authentic psychological processes. The efficacy of dogma, however, by no means rests on Christ's unique historical reality, but on its own symbolic nature, by virtue of which it expresses a more or less ubiquitous psychological assumption quite independent of the existence of any dogma. Jung explores how Christ Pantocrator, the Almighty, functions as an imago lapidis, an image of the stone. This connection reveals the cosmic dimension of the self-archetype, how it represents not just individual wholeness, but universal integration. The cosmic Christ parallels the alchemical understanding of the lapis as microcosm, a representation of the entire universe in miniature form. Jung refers to a passage from pseudo-Aristotle where the circle re-emerges from a triangle set in a square, and writes, "This circular figure, together with the Ouroboros, the dragon devouring itself tail first, is the basic mandala of alchemy." Similarly and complementary to Jung's psychology and alchemy, which is the subject matter of this video, the Atalanta Fujian emblem 21 reads as follows: "Make of a man and woman a circle, then a quadrangle. Out of this a triangle, make again a circle, and you will have the stone of the wise. Thus is made the stone which thou canst not discover, unless you through diligence learn to understand this geometrical teaching." This geometric symbolism represents the process of psychological integration from the original unity, circle, through differentiation, quadrangle, and partial integration, triangle, to a higher unity, circle, that contains all previous stages in conscious relationship. Jung notes, Christ the Pantocrator is an imago lapidis. He is the lapis angularis, the cornerstone, that was rejected by the builders and then became the head of the corner, a rock of offense and a stone of stumbling. This connection reveals the paradoxical nature of the self, how it appears initially as obstacle, as stumbling block, as that which disrupts our conscious identity. Only through confronting this disruption can we achieve the higher integration the self represents. One key aspect of this integration involves the mandala structure that appears in Jung's analysis. The mandalas of ecclesiastical art, particularly those on the floor before the high altar or beneath the transept, make frequent use of the zodiacal beasts or the yearly seasons. A related idea is the identity of Christ with the church calendar, of which he is the fixed pole and the life. This pattern reveals the archetypal function of Christ symbolism. The Son of Man is an anticipation of the idea of the self, hence the Gnostic adulteration of Christ with the other synonyms for the self among the Nasans recorded by Hippolytus. The parallel between Christ and the self also appears in how Jung addresses the quaternity symbol. The 32 pulses may conceivably derive from the multiplication of 4 times 8, as we know from experience that the quaternity found at the center of a mandala often becomes 8, 16, 32 or more when extended to the periphery. This numerical symbolism connects to sacred traditions. The 32 canales occulti are also mentioned by Knorr von Rosenroth, who calls Chokhmah the supreme path of all, embracing all. On the authority of Job 28:7, there is a path which no fowl knoweth, and which the vulture's eye hath not seen. The manifestation of the self involves transformation through suffering, a pattern visible in both Christian and alchemical symbolism. Melchior makes this connection explicit when he associates the offertory with the stone that the builders rejected and that became the head of the corner. This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. The self brings together what conventional consciousness separates. As Jung quotes from an Allegoria Sanctissimae Trinitatis et Lapidis Philosophici, therefore Mercurius Philosophorum is to be considered a spiritual body, as the philosophers call him. So too is the gold without flaw, and is fixed, potent to withstand all examinations and glorious. Yet, for the sake of its imperfect and sick brothers and sisters, it dies and rises again glorious and redeemed, and tinctures them to eternal life, making them perfect like to pure gold. Ultimately, the self represents the reconciliation of opposites into a higher unity, a process that transcends logic yet manifests in symbolic patterns across religious and alchemical traditions. In this integration, we discover the wholeness that is our deepest psychological potential, not as escape from the world, but as its transfiguration through conscious relationship to the archetypal forces that shape both psyche and cosmos. Jung identifies a profound alchemical concept that complements Christianity's focus on Christ as Redeemer of humanity, the Filius Macrocosmi, or Son of the Macrocosm, who redeems not humanity, but the cosmos itself. He writes, "Just as the redemption of man, the microcosm, is the task of the upper sun, so the lower sun has the function of a Salvator Macrocosmi." This concept reveals how alchemy extended redemption beyond the human realm to include the material world. Where Christianity focused on saving human souls, alchemy recognized the need to redeem matter itself, to liberate the divine spark imprisoned in the physical universe. Jung explains, the historical shift in the world's consciousness towards the masculine is compensated at first by the chthonic femininity of the unconscious. In certain pre-Christian religions, the differentiation of the masculine principle had taken the form of the father-son specification, a change which was to be of the utmost importance for Christianity. This father-son dynamic appears in both Christianity and alchemy, but with a crucial difference. Christianity emphasizes the upper son, Christ, who descends from heaven to save humanity. Alchemy focuses on the lower son, who emerges from matter to save the cosmos. Jung observes how this difference reflects psychological compensation. Were the unconscious merely complementary, this shift of consciousness would have been accompanied by the production of a mother and daughter, for which the necessary material lay ready to hand in the myth of Demeter and Persephone. But as alchemy shows, the unconscious chose rather the Sibyl Attis type, in the form of the prima materia and the Filius Macrocosmi, thus proving that it is not complementary but compensatory. This compensation reveals how the unconscious doesn't simply invert conscious attitudes, but modifies them in the manner of an opponent or partner. Where Christianity emphasized spirit-saving humanity, alchemy envisioned humanity helping to save matter, a partnership rather than a hierarchy. The Filius Macrocosmi reveals aspects of divinity that Christianity tended to exclude or minimize, particularly its connection to matter, darkness, and the feminine. Jung writes, "The primordial mother, who was anterior to the world of the father, accommodates herself to the masculine principle, and with the aid of the human spirit, alchemy or the philosophy, produces a son, not the antithesis of Christ, but rather his chthonic counterpart, not a divine man, but a fabulous being conforming to the nature of the primordial mother. This chthonic counterpart to Christ represents the shadow side of divinity, its connection to matter, to darkness, to the unconscious depths that Christianity tended to reject or externalize as demonic. Jung recognizes this as psychological compensation, the unconscious producing what conscious attitudes exclude. The Filius Macrocosmi embodies what Heinrich Kuhnrath called the fiery masculine seed of the divine and the unspotted light of nature. This divine spark exists not beyond the material world, but within it, waiting to be liberated through conscious human engagement. Jung quotes an alchemical text describing how Mercurius is virginal because he has never increased any kind of metallic body in the bowels of the earth, and yet has generated the stone for us by means of the solution of heaven. That is to say, he opens the gold and leads out the soul, which you must understand as a divinity, divinitatum. And for a little while he carries it in his belly, and in his own time he changes it into a purified body, whence there shall come to us the boy, puer, the lapis, by whose blood the lower bodies are tinctured, tincta, and taken back whole to the golden heaven." This reveals how alchemy understood redemption as something emerging from within matter itself through human co-authorship in the transformative process. Jung explores how alchemy paralleled Christianity's central sacrament, the Mass, but with a crucial difference in orientation. He writes, "Whereas Catholicism emphasizes the effectual presence of Christ, alchemy is interested in the fate and manifest redemption of the substances, for in them the divine soul lies captive and awaits the redemption that is granted to it at the moment of release. The captive soul then appears in the form of the Son of God." This parallel reveals alchemy's psychological compensation for Christianity's emphasis on transcendence. Where Christianity focused on the divine descending into humanity, alchemy focused on humanity helping the divine ascend from matter. Jung explains how this inverts the Christian understanding of redemption. By pronouncing the consecrating words that bring about the transformation, the priest redeems the bread and wine from their elemental imperfection as created things. This idea is quite unchristian, it is alchemical. The alchemist's work parallels the priest's consecration, but with matter rather than humanity as the focus of redemption. For the alchemist, the one primarily in need of redemption is not man, but the deity who is lost and sleeping in matter. Only as a secondary consideration does he hope that some benefit may accrue to himself from the transformed substance as the panacea, the medicina catholica, just as it may to the imperfect bodies, the base or sick metals, etc. This inversion creates a fundamentally different relationship to the divine. The alchemist doesn't merely receive divine grace, but actively participates in liberating the divine from matter. His attention is not directed to his own salvation through God's grace, but to the liberation of God from the darkness of matter. By applying himself to this miraculous work, he benefits from its salutary effect, but only incidentally. Jung observes how this approach transforms the alchemist's spiritual journey. The alchemist was concerned with the problem of how to implant the soul in the body. This inverts Christianity's emphasis on liberating the soul from the body, focusing instead on how spirit and matter can be integrated rather than separated. Jung knew that these ancient symbolic systems remain psychologically relevant for modern consciousness. It's a profound revelation about the structure of the Western psyche and the path to psychological wholeness. The Christ Lapis Parallel reveals how the same fundamental process of transformation has been expressed through different symbolic languages, religious and alchemical, spiritual and material, collective and individual. These parallels are psychologically necessary, arising from the same archetypal patterns in the collective unconscious. But Jung's analysis also exposes a critical split in Western consciousness, between the Christian emphasis on transcendence and redemption from above, and the alchemical focus on immanence and transformation from below. This split has shaped Western psychology, creating a fundamental tension between our spiritual aspirations and material existence, between our conscious ideals and unconscious realities. Jung observes the modern relevance of the struggle of polarities. The two opposed points of view meet in the ecclesiastical formula of the opus operatum and the opus operantis. But in the last analysis, they are irreconcilable. Fundamentally, it is a question of polar opposites: the collective or the individual, society or personality. This polarity continues shaping modern consciousness. What medieval people projected onto Christ and the Lapis, we still project onto external figures and substances, celebrities, political leaders, material possessions, psychoactive drugs. We still seek external salvation rather than internal transformation, still expect redemption from outside rather than recognizing our role in our own psychological integration. Jung suggests that genuine development requires withdrawing these projections and recognizing the Christ archetype as representing our own potential wholeness. Christ can be recognized as a symbol of the self. This mode of expression is an intellectual necessity in scientific psychology and in no sense denotes a transcendental prejudice. This recognition enhances religious meaning by revealing its psychological depth. The symbolism works precisely because it connects to authentic psychological realities. The individuation process is, psychologically, a life in God. The religious path and the psychological path converge on the same destination: the integration of the divided self, the reconciliation of opposites, the achievement of wholeness. Jung explores the profound symbolism of the rejected cornerstone, a biblical image that connects Christ directly to the Lapis Philosophorum and reveals the paradoxical nature of psychological transformation. He writes, "Christ is the lapis angularis, the cornerstone, that was rejected by the builders and then became the head of the corner." This biblical reference, Psalm 118:22, Matthew 21:42, identifies Christ with the stone that the builders rejected, a symbol that also appears consistently in alchemical texts describing the prima materia. Both Christ and the lapis initially appear as obstacles, as stumbling blocks, as that which established consciousness rejects. Only later do they reveal themselves as the foundation for a new and higher integration. Jung quotes from Melchior, who associates the offertory with the stone that the builders rejected and that became the head of the corner. "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." As we already mentioned earlier, this connection extends the parallel beyond superficial similarity to essential psychological identity. Both Christ and the lapis represent what consciousness initially rejects, but which proves essential for transformation. Just as the builders rejected the stone that would become the cornerstone, consciousness rejects the shadow that would become essential for psychological integration. This rejection creates projection. We see our disowned qualities in others rather than recognizing them as aspects of ourselves. In every sphere of our lives, we encounter those rigid judgments, those demonic compulsions, those crippling wounds that Christ himself faced. Look closely at your own circumstances. The self-righteous critics, the tormented souls, the broken seekers, they surround us daily. Paradoxically, it is the most profound suffering that creates the greatest opportunity for transformative compassion. This explains why the most severe psychological afflictions often yield the most remarkable healings. The deeper the darkness, the more powerful the light that eventually emerges. What the conscious mind first dismisses as worthless or threatening becomes, through the alchemy of honest engagement, authenticity essence. Like the biblical stone cast aside by builders only to become essential to the entire structure, our disowned shadows, once faced with courage and compassion, transform from obstacles into foundations. This paradoxical journey from rejection to elevation reveals the hidden wisdom in what we most resist acknowledging about ourselves. Alchemical texts consistently describe the prima materia, the starting substance of the great work, as common, despised, and rejected. Jung notes how it can be had for the asking and can be found anywhere, even in the most loathsome filth. This description reminds of Christ's humble origins and rejection by established authority. Both represent what conventional consciousness overlooks or devalues, but which contains the seed of transformation. Jung quotes an alchemical text, describing the stone as altogether vile, cast upon the dung heap. This language deliberately echoes biblical descriptions of the suffering servant and Christ's passion, the divine appearing in the most rejected and despised form. The parallel reveals a profound psychological principle, that transformation begins not with what consciousness values, but with what it rejects. The shadow, the unconscious, the despised aspects of ourselves, these contain the prima materia for psychological growth. Jung was right. Most of us don't do the necessary work, so few can truly become spiritual through personal experience. Few experience the dark nights of soul necessary to touch the Logos. And is not this an effect of Christianity's one-sided emphasis on goodness, light, and spirit? This is a conclusion you have to arrive at on your own. However, the problem is simple and evident. The rejected darkness, materiality, and instinctuality don't disappear, but go underground, emerging in distorted forms that contradict conscious Christian values and sometimes erupt at unexpected times, in unexpected ways, with unexpected force and consequences. The alchemical approach offers a different path, not rejecting this darkness, but transforming it, recognizing its essential role in the integrative process. The prima materia isn't something to be overcome, but something to be transformed, just as the shadow isn't something to be eliminated, but something to be integrated, to be negotiated with, to be employed for good reasons. Jung explores how both Christ and the lapis embody the paradox of redemption, how transformation emerges from apparent destruction, how life emerges from death, how elevation emerges from rejection. He writes, Christ the sacrificant is also the sacrificed. This paradoxical identity appears in alchemy as well, where the alchemist both transforms the stone and is transformed by it, where the agent of redemption becomes the object of redemption. This paradox reveals something essential about psychological transformation, how it requires both active agency and passive surrender, both conscious effort and receptivity to the unconscious. Just the universe being paradoxical as usual. The cornerstones rejection and elevation symbolize this paradoxical process. How what consciousness initially rejects becomes, through conscious confrontation and acceptance, the foundation for a more complete self-understanding. What appeared as obstacle becomes cornerstone. What appeared as shadow becomes source of light. Jung quotes the paradoxical alchemical description. Our son of royal birth takes his tincture from the fire, and death, darkness, and the waters flee away. The dragon shuns the light of the sun, and our dead son shall live. The king shall come forth from the fire and rejoice in the marriage. The hidden things shall be disclosed, and the virgin's milk be whitened. The sun is become a warrior fire and surpasses the tincture, for he himself is the treasure, and himself is attired in the philosophic matter. The enigmatic symbolism of this language unveils the profound metamorphosis of the psyche, a journey where the confines of narrow perception dissolve, allowing the self to emerge anew, reintegrated and expansive. In the alchemical process, the once shunned shadow becomes rebirth, as what initially seemed to be an impenetrable darkness is gradually revealed to be a wellspring of concealed illumination, guiding the soul towards a more comprehensive understanding of its own essence and all the dimensions of reality. Jung explores how alchemy functions psychologically as a symbolic system, expressing the same transformative process that Christianity encoded in Christ's life, death, and resurrection. In alchemy, we are dealing with a psychological process expressing itself in chemical terms and thus forming a bridge on the one hand with the physical cosmos and on the other with the spiritual and metaphysical. This bridge-building capacity reveals alchemy's psychological significance, how it connected realms that Christianity tended to separate: matter and spirit, body and soul, physical processes and spiritual transformation. Jung observes how alchemical symbolism preserved what Christianity often excluded. The message of the Christian symbol is gnosis, and the compensation effected by the unconscious is gnosis in even higher degree. Myth is the primordial language natural to these psychic processes, and no intellectual formulation comes anywhere near the richness and expressiveness of mythical imagery. This Gnostic element, the recognition of direct knowledge of divine mysteries through inner experience, appears consistently in alchemical texts. Jung quotes an alchemist who wrote, "Therefore, Mercurius Philosophorum is to be considered a spiritual body, as the philosophers call him." This spiritual body represents the integration of opposites that Christianity often separated: spirit and matter, divine and human, conscious and unconscious. The alchemical Mercurius embodies this integration, serving as agent of transformation precisely because he contains all opposites in dynamic tension. Jung writes, "It would be more correct to take the open conflict as a symptom of the psychic situation of Western man, and to deplore his inability to assimilate the whole range of the Christian symbol." This observation reveals alchemy's psychological function, compensating for Christianity's one-sided emphasis on spirit, light, and goodness by recovering the value of matter, darkness, and shadow. Jung explores how alchemical symbolism emphasizes what Christianity often minimized: the necessary darkness of transformation, the nigredo phase where the prima materia decomposes before rebirth can occur. He writes, "The sun is an antique symbol that is still very close to us. We know also that the early Christians had some difficulty in distinguishing the Helios Anatoles, the rising sun, from Christ. This solar symbolism connects Christ with transformation from darkness to light, death followed by resurrection. But alchemy emphasizes what Christianity often minimized: how this transformation requires passing through darkness rather than avoiding it." Jung quotes an uncanonical saying of our Lord, "He who is near unto me is near unto the fire." This connection between divinity and transformative fire appears in Heraclitus's concept of pur e zoon, ever-living fire, and in the alchemical understanding of their aqua nostra as ignis, fire. The alchemical laboratory is a space where the psyche could express itself through symbolic operations: dissolution, calcination, sublimation, conjunction, fermentation, multiplication, and projection. Each chemical process paralleled a psychological one, allowing the alchemist to engage with unconscious contents indirectly through material manipulations. Jung writes, "This state of possession shows itself almost without exception in the fact that the possessed identify themselves with the archetypal contents of their unconscious, and, because they do not realize that the role which is being thrust upon them is the effect of new content still to be understood, they exemplify these concretely in their own lives, thus becoming prophets and reformers." Insofar as the archetypal content of the Christian drama was able to give satisfying expression to the uneasy and clamorous unconscious of the many, the consensus omnium raised this drama to a universally binding truth, not of course by an act of judgment, but by the irrational fact of possession, which is far more effective. Thus, Jesus became the tutelary image or amulet against the archetypal powers that threatened to possess everyone. The glad tidings announced, "It has happened, but it will not happen to you inasmuch as you believe in Jesus Christ, the Son of God." Yet it could, and it can, and it will happen to everyone in whom the Christian dominant has decayed. For this reason, there have always been people who, not satisfied with the dominance of conscious life, set forth, under cover and by devious paths, to their destruction or salvation, to seek direct experience of the eternal roots, and, following the lure of the restless unconscious psyche, find themselves in the wilderness where, like Jesus, they come up against the son of darkness, antemimon pneuma. Thus an old alchemist, and he a cleric, prays, "Horridas nostrae mentis purga tenebras, accende lumen sensibus." Purge the horrible darknesses of our mind, light a light for our senses. The author of this sentence must have been undergoing the experience of the nigredo, the first stage of the work, which was felt as melancholia in alchemy and corresponds to the encounter with the shadow in psychology. The alchemists unwittingly became vehicles for archetypal content seeking expression, for psychological patterns that Christianity had excluded or minimized. Their work with physical substances allowed these contents to manifest in concrete form, creating a bridge between spirit and matter, between conscious intention and unconscious process. This bridge-building function reveals alchemy's psychological significance, how it connected realms that Christianity tended to separate. Jung writes, like the lapis, the tinctura rubea, and the aurum philosophicum, the squaring of the circle was a problem that greatly exercised medieval minds. It is a symbol of the opus alchemicum, since it breaks down the original chaotic unity into the four elements, and then combines them again in a higher unity. This mathematical problem symbolizes psychological integration, how consciousness differentiates from initial unconsciousness, represented by the circle, into four distinct functions, represented by the square, then reintegrates them in a higher unity that preserves their distinctness while transcending their separation. Jung explains, unity is represented by a circle and the four elements by a square. The production of one from four is the result of a process of distillation and sublimation, which takes the so-called circular form. The distillate is subjected to sundry distillations so that the soul or spirit shall be extracted in its purest state. This circular process parallels individuation, how the psyche evolves from undifferentiated unconsciousness through differentiation of psychological functions to their reintegration in a more conscious unity. The circle represents wholeness, the square represents structure and differentiation, and their integration represents psychological completeness. Remember when Jung quotes Heinrich Kunrat, through circumrotation or a circular philosophical revolving of the quaternarios, it is brought back to the highest and purest simplicity of the plusquamperfect Catholic monad. Out of the gross and impure one, there cometh an exceeding pure and subtile one. The transformation from gross to pure unity symbolizes psychological development, how consciousness evolves from initial unconscious immersion through differentiation to conscious integration. The initial unity lacks differentiation, while the final unity includes differentiation within a higher synthesis. As we previously mentioned, this geometric symbolism connects with psychological functions, thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition, that Jung identified as the four basic modes of conscious orientation. Their integration represents psychological wholeness, the ability to engage with reality through all four functions in a balanced way. Jung notes, this circular figure, together with the Ouroboros, the dragon devouring itself tail first, is the basic mandala of alchemy. The mandala, circle, represents wholeness, while the Ouroboros represents the self-consuming and self-renewing nature of psychological transformation. How the ego must die to its limited perspective for the self to emerge. The same way Ra rises as Horus and completes each daily cycle as Atum, only to be reborn again as a new Horus with the help of Osiris. This mathematical geometric symbolism reveals alchemy's psychological sophistication, how it encoded complex psychological processes in seemingly abstract forms. The squaring of the circle represents what Jung would later call individuation, the integration of conscious and unconscious elements into a more complete whole. The Lapis Philosophorum embodies this integration of opposites, functioning as a squared circle that reconciles opposing elements in paradoxical unity. The stone's paradoxical nature appears in what Jung calls the coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites that transcends logical contradiction through higher integration. Jung quotes an alchemical text describing how soul and spirit must be separated from the body, and this is equivalent to death. Therefore Paul of Tarsus saith, Cupio dissolvi et esse cum Christo. Therefore, my dear philosopher, must thou catch the spirit and soul of the magnesia. This separation, followed by reintegration, is exact psychological development. how consciousness differentiates from unconscious immersion, identifies distinct psychological functions, then reintegrates them in a more conscious relationship. The death and resurrection symbolism represents this psychological process, the death of unconscious identification followed by rebirth in more integrated consciousness. The squared circle symbolizes this integration, how the four elements, represented by the square, combine with the original unity, represented by the circle, to create something that transcends both in higher synthesis. This geometric symbolism encodes the psychological process of individuation, how differentiated consciousness reintegrates with its unconscious foundation to create a more complete whole. Jung writes, "The lapis is presented as the arcanum, the panacea, the pharmakon athanasias, and is usually characterized by paradoxical opposites, as we have seen. This paradoxical nature reveals the stone's psychological function, integrating opposites that conventional consciousness tends to separate. The squared circle represents this integration mathematically, showing how seemingly irreconcilable forms, the perfect circle and the angular square, can be approximated in relationship. This mathematical problem symbolizes the psychological challenge of integrating seemingly opposed aspects of ourselves, thinking and feeling, sensation and intuition, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow. Jung's exploration of the Christ Lapis Parallel reveals the divided architecture of Western consciousness and points toward its potential integration. He writes, "In dealing with alchemy, we must always consider what an important part this philosophy played in the Middle Ages, what a vast literature it left behind, and what a far-reaching effect it had on the spiritual life of the time. How far the claims of alchemy itself went in this direction is best shown by the Lapis-Christ Parallel, a fact which may explain, or excuse, my excursions into fields that seem to have nothing to do with alchemy. Christianity and alchemy approached the same transformative process from different directions, revealing how Western consciousness has struggled to integrate opposing elements of human experience." Jung concludes with a vision of psychological development as ongoing cosmic process. We are then confronted with the underlying human psyche, which, unlike consciousness, hardly changes at all in the course of many centuries. Here, a truth that is 2,000 years old is still the truth today. In other words, it is still alive and active. Here too we find those fundamental psychic facts that remain unchanged for thousands of years and will still be unchanged thousands of years hence. His final insight speaks to this continuing evolution. From this point of view, the recent past and the present seem like episodes in a drama that began in the grey mists of antiquity and continues through the centuries into a remote future. This drama is an aurora consurgens, the dawning of consciousness in mankind. The Christ Lapis Parallel reveals a crucial stage in this evolution, showing how Western consciousness has approached integration through complementary symbolic systems. The journey continues today as we face the same psychological challenges. As we conclude this exploration of Jung's Christ Lapis Parallel from his book, Psychology and Alchemy, I invite you to contemplate on how these ancient symbols and patterns impact your life in particular. Though we may not be medieval alchemists or devout Christians, we all face the same fundamental psychological tensions the alchemists encoded in their sacred images and texts. The integration of the divided parts of ourselves, of reconciling the opposites that tear us apart internally and externally. Today it's very easy to feel fragmented, isolated, confused, scared, lost, disconnected from our deeper selves and from the unifying ground of being. We may seek wholeness through external means, relationships, achievements, possessions, peak experiences, fast cars, drugs, sex, others' opinions and validation, only to find that true integration must come from within. The alchemical process is this inner work. Just as the alchemists sought to transform base metals into gold, we must have the courage to face our own base elements, our shadows, our wounds, our rejected parts, our nightmares, our dramas, our fears and tears, and to transform them through conscious engagement. You must sit with the darkness and discomfort you'd prefer to avoid. But as both Christ's passion and the alchemical Negredo suggest, it is only by passing through this ashes that we can emerge reborn, transformed, made whole like a phoenix. In our own ways, we are all modern alchemists, whether we realize it or not. Every time we encounter something that shakes our sense of self, every time we question long-held beliefs or integrate a painful truth, every time we open to change from our deepest principles and essences, we participate in the same process of dissolution and reintegration that Jung discerned in both Christian and alchemical symbolism. The specifics may look different: a midlife crisis rather than a confrontation with the devil, a dark night of the soul rather than a chemical operation. But the underlying archetypal pattern is the same. We are called to evolve from unconscious immersion in our fragmented lives to conscious wholeness, to the royal marriage of opposites within our own hearts. It takes great faith and fortitude to walk this path. But as Jung's analysis reveals, it is the path walked by all those who seek a more complete humanity, a humanity that integrates everything that reality has to offer, and the products on the menu are quite innumerable. Today, we may resist the notion that this journey has a religious dimension. But as both Christ and the Lapis suggest, the self we seek is not separate from the divine mystery. To become whole is to see the God within ourselves, not as an inflation of the ego, but as a humbling recognition of the greater unity we arise from and belong to. Our world needs more people with the courage to walk this Christic path. In the face of crises, wars, polarization, fragmentation, alienation, acceleration, the work of wholeness has never been more urgent. So I invite you, dear seeker, to take up this alchemical work in your own life. Start where you are, with the prima materia of your own experience. Be open to the unexpected forms that the archetypes may take as they guide you from within. And trust that as you step into the fire of transformation, you participate in the greater work of integrating human consciousness with its divine ground. May your journey be blessed with the wisdom of Jung, the inspiration of the alchemists, and the grace of the self that guides us all from the depths. The Philosopher's Stone is not just a relic of the past, but a living potential within each human heart. The work of embodying it is the great adventure we are called to in our time. Thank you for walking this path of wisdom with me. May the light you discover within radiate into the world and help illumine the way for others. With gratitude and respect, Irrevelato.